What's up, everyone? Welcome to the Who Wants to Brawl YouTube channel. That is not a question, that is a statement. My name is Who, and I'm letting you know I want to brawl. Here, we're all about the Magic format brawl, specifically in regards to Magic Arena, so we don't have to worry about budget, we only have to worry about wildcards.
This episode is a new deck tech. On these episodes, I go over a new Brawl commander and walk you through my ideas and strategies of how best to build this commander. Today we have Rankle, Master of Pranks, as our commander. With a commander like this, we're going to be sacrificing a lot of our creatures, making them sacrifice their creatures, and discarding our cards and getting them back in the later game. Rankle is a 4-mana 3/3 with flying and haste that, when it deals combat damage, we choose any number of these. Each player discards a card, each player draws a card and loses 1 life, or each player sacrifices a creature. If you choose multiple, they have to do them in that order. This card is very flexible and allows us to manipulate our opponent in the way that best suits us. So for strategies with Rankle, we're going to have to do a couple different things. We're going to have to make sure we have creatures that we don't care if we sacrifice, and we're going to have to make sure we have cards we don't care if we discard. Most of the time with Rankle, we're not going to be choosing the draw a card, lose a life, because we don't want our opponents to draw cards with this deck. Every once in a while, we do want them to lose that life, and every once in a while, we do want to draw the card, so that is a nice bonus to have if the situation calls for it, but most of the time, we're going to avoid that one. So with that, let's see how we can use Rankle's abilities to best suit our needs. Our first strategy is a sacrifice I am willing to make. With this strategy, we're going to be choosing cards that we don't mind if we sacrifice. These are cards that have an enter the battlefield ability, that are a small creature that already did their use, or creatures that give us a bonus when they die. It's pretty much as simple as that. Acquisition Expert and Foulmire Knight already served their purpose while they're on the battlefield, and they're small enough that we don't care if we end up having to sacrifice them. The Acquisition Expert causes our opponent to discard a card. By revealing cards equal to the amount of party members we have, we choose one of them and they discard it. Usually in this deck that's only 1 card, but that doesn't actually matter. We just want to make them discard a card. And then the Foulmire Knight has an adventure. For 3 mana, we draw a card and lose 1 life. But for 1 mana, it's just a 1/1 death touch. If it's already on the battlefield, we can't cast it as an adventure. And if it's on the battlefield as just a 1/1 death touch, they're probably not going to attack into it, so we don't mind sacrificing that to make our opponent sacrifice a creature. Piper of the Swarm can continuously pump out extra 1/1 creatures for us to sacrifice. For 2 mana, it creates a 1/1 rat. And then for 4 mana and sacrificing 3 rats, we can gain control of target creature. That doesn't happen too often in this deck because, like I said, we're sacrificing those rats, so we don't usually build up to 3. And Sanitarium Skeleton has a recurring ability that for 3 mana, we can return it from our graveyard to our hand, and it's a 1 mana 1/2 skeleton. A creature like this we absolutely do not mind sacrificing just because later in the game we can get it back and cast it pretty cheaply, allowing us a continuous sacrifice bait to ensure that we don't have to sacrifice Rankle and we keep ensuring that our opponents sacrifice their best creatures. These next 4 creatures each have a trigger when they die, giving us more value for sacrificing them than our opponents will get for sacrificing their creatures. Solemn Simulacrum draws a card when it dies and also comes with the upside of entering the battlefield and searching for a basic land and putting it onto the battlefield tapped. Serrated Scorpion dies and causes our opponents to lose 2 life and we gain 2 life, while Deathbloom Thallid and Discordant Piper each leave behind a creature when they die. Oftentimes we don't want to attack with these when Rankle is attacking, because if they block one of these creatures die and therefore are not on the battlefield to sack to Rankle's trigger. But if we have a free attack with them, by all means swing away. Our next strategy is Bring That Back. In a deck that sacrifices and discards our own things, we want to make sure we get back the threats and cards we need when we need them to ensure we can continuously sacrificing or in order to get the win when the situation comes up. Null Priest of Oblivion, Thwart the Grave, and Unbreakable Bond each bring a creature back from our graveyard to the battlefield in different ways. The Null Priest brings it back when it enters the battlefield if we kicked it. Also, when it brings a creature back, it becomes an easy body to sacrifice with Rankle. Unbreakable Bond brings it back with a lifelink counter, and Thwart the Grave brings back a creature and a party member. Usually when we play Thwart the Grave, Rankle will be the target if we had to sacrifice it or wanted to sacrifice it earlier in the game to bring back Rankle and a different creature. And if Nightmare Shepherd is on the board, when a creature we control dies, we may exile it from our graveyard to put a 1/1 version of that creature onto the battlefield as well. So this will always give us an additional body, and sometimes we'll even want to exile Rankle with this ability, because whether we do 3 damage or 1 damage with Rankle really doesn't matter. We just want to make sure we hit them with Rankle. So with Nightmare Shepherd on the battlefield, we can sack Rankle to its own ability, exile Rankle, putting it into the command zone, and then still have a 1/1 copy of Rankle. If you're going to do this, you have to make sure you decline to put it into your command zone first to allow the Nightmare Shepherd to trigger, and then put it into your command zone when you exile it. I have been burned by accidentally doing the wrong one, and it sucks when it happens. And then Order of Midnight is a 2-mana 2/2 flyer that has an adventure that we can return a creature from our graveyard to our hand. This is a nice card in this deck because as a creature, it is an easy body to sacrifice, and as an adventure, it can get back a card to discard with Rankle or a creature to play and sacrifice with Rankle. Or if we need to, we can get a card we already discarded back to our hand that will help us win the game. Our next strategy is I don't need this. These cards are cards that we don't mind discarding to Rankle, especially early, because they're usually more expensive and will help us in the late game once we get there. But in the early game, we discard them and then get them back later in the game. Next up, we have Clackbridge Troll, which is 5 mana for an 8/8 trample haste that when it enters the battlefield, we give our opponent 3/01 goats. Then at the beginning of combat on our turn, our opponent may sacrifice a creature, and if they do, we tap it, gain 3 life, and draw a card. We throw this one away because giving our opponent creatures to sacrifice is not good in the early game with Rankle. We want to play or reanimate this card later in the game when our opponent has run out of gas, allowing us to have a big creature and then refilling our hand. And next we have Suffocating Fumes, which is 3 mana for an instant that says creatures our opponents control get -1/-1 until end of turn, and we can cycle it for 2 mana. So this card has multiple purposes. The first is obviously to discard a Rankle. The second is to cycle it away, and the third one is a just in case if our opponent plays a Scute Swarm. I've been burned too many times by Scute Swarm to not put insurance in all of my decks. If we're not playing Scute Swarm, this is an easy card to discard with Rankle or with sacrificing. Our third card we don't mind discarding is Massacre Worm. As a 6 mana card, it's difficult to play in the early game, but in the later game, it enters the battlefield and gives our opponent's creatures -2/-2, and then burns our opponent for 2 life when a creature they control dies. In the later game, when Rankle's on the battlefield and we have other creatures to sacrifice, this can be absolutely devastating, constantly making them lose life for sacrificing their creatures. But in the early game, we really don't want it in our hand. So this is a perfect card to discard and then reanimate later in the game. And then our final card we don't mind discarding is Skyclave Shade, which is 2 mana for a 3/1 that can't block. If it was kicked, it enters the battlefield with 2 +1/+1 counters, and most importantly for us, that whenever a land enters the battlefield under our control, we can cast it from our graveyard. So this is also a creature we don't mind sacrificing. I just happen to put it in the don't mind discarding category. Having a creature that comes back on its own is constantly useful in a deck that wants to sacrifice its creatures. This is a perfect card for a Rankle deck. Our next strategy is removal. For those that have already watched my channel, I've told you time and time again, and I will continue to tell you that removal is absolutely crucial to any Brawl deck. You have to be able to get rid of your opponent's commander and your opponent's plan. Rankle does have built-in removal, but that doesn't mean that's where we should stop. Extinction Event exiles all creatures with a converted mana cost odd or even, depending on the state of the board. Liliana, Waker of the Dead, is a planeswalker with a +1 ability that each player discards a card, adding to the discard of Rankle. Its -3 says target creature gets -X until end of turn, where X is the number of cards in your graveyard. And it has an ultimate ability for -7 that says we get an emblem with, at the beginning of combat on our turn, put target creature card from a graveyard onto the battlefield under our control, and it gains haste. The ultimate will almost never happen in this deck because we're always going to want to remove a creature with it, but between this being removal and discard for our opponent, this is a perfect synergy card in the deck. Murderous Rider is a 3-mana 2/3 with lifelink that when it dies it shuffles into our library, but the most important part is it has an adventure which for 3 mana destroys a creature or a planeswalker and we lose 2 life. Reave the Soul destroys a creature with power 3 or less, and Heartless Act is a 2-mana instant that destroys a creature with no counters on it or removes 3 counters from a creature. The second part of that card doesn't come up too often, but when it does, it is an absolute lifesaver. Next up, we have what might be my vote for the best removal in Brawl at the moment. That is Elspeth's Nightmare, which is a 3-mana enchantment saga. Chapter 1 says destroy target creature an opponent controls with power 2 or less. Its second chapter says target opponent reveals their hand, you choose a non-creature, non-land card from it, and that player discards that card. And chapter 3 says exile target opponent's graveyard. This card is a built-in 2-for-1, and that second chapter is what really puts it over the edge, allowing you to choose the best non-creature, non-land card in their hand. And then we have Bloodchief's Thirst, which is a 1-mana sorcery that says destroy target creature or planeswalker with converted mana cost 2 or less. It also has Kicker for 2 and a black, and if we kick it, we can destroy any creature or planeswalker. Then we have Epic Downfall, which is a 2-mana sorcery that says exile target creature with converted mana cost 3 or greater. Exile is always important in a deck that's constantly making people discard or sacrifice their creatures. That way, if it's a reanimator deck, they can't reanimate their creatures. And then Feed the Swarm is a 2-mana sorcery that says destroy target creature or enchantment an opponent controls and we lose life equal to that permanent's converted mana cost. So this is the only black card, I think in the history of Magic, not just the current Brawl format, that allows a black card to destroy target enchantment. So this is an absolute must to include. Our next strategy is our utility pieces. These are cards that don't necessarily fit with the theme of the deck, but nonetheless help to round out the deck and make it run smoothly. Arcane Signet and Nyx Lotus each help us ramp out in different ways. Arcane Signet adds 1 mana of our commander's color identity, and Nyx Lotus enters the battlefield tapped and adds mana equal to our devotion to the color of our choice. In this deck, that will be black. Nighthawk Scavenger is just an efficient creature at 3 mana for a 1+*3 flying Death Touch lifelink that gets +1 for each card type among cards in our opponent's graveyards. We're constantly making them discard cards, so that can fill up pretty quickly. Kitesail Freebooter allows us to look at our opponent's hand and exile a non-creature, non-land card until the freebooter leaves the battlefield. This is not a card we want to sacrifice because we usually end up giving them their card back, but this does ensure that Rankle can survive a little bit easier, and that's good enough for this deck. Ayara and Erebos each allow us to draw cards when a creature we control dies in different ways. We have to sack the creature to Ayara's ability in order to draw the card from Ayara, but she comes with the upside of draining our opponent for 1 life anytime a black creature enters the battlefield. And we can pay 2 life with Erebos anytime a creature we control dies to draw a card. And since we have a lot of creatures we don't mind sacrificing running around in this deck, sometimes we can sacrifice a creature to Erebos' ability in order to ease combat on our creatures a little bit. Our final strategy is just double-face modal cards. These are cards that we can cast as a spell or play as a land early in the game, and that flexibility is enough that even if the card doesn't really make sense in our deck, we should include them anyway. Agadeem's Awakening allows us to bring back a number of creatures equal to X, as long as each card has a different converted mana cost of X or less. We have a good chunk of small creatures in this deck and medium-sized creatures in this deck, so this card often ends up bringing back 2 or 3 cards as long as we get X to equal 4 or so. And this card also has the upside of not coming into play tapped if we choose to pay 3 life. Malakir Rebirth can bring a creature we sacrifice or our opponent kills back from our graveyard to the battlefield as long as we pay 2 life. Palaka Predation is another discard card in this deck. Out of all the double-face modal cards in this deck, this is the one we cast the most often. to ensure that we discard the card we want to discard versus the card our opponent gets to throw away that's the least useful to them. We also have Zoth Consumption, which drains our opponent for 4 life for 6 mana. It's a good finisher in the late game, but most of the time we play it as a land. It's just a land with upside in our deck. And finally, every deck needs some land. We're going to start with 19 Swamps. Evolving Wild and Fabled Passage are fetch lands to thin out the deck a little bit, with the land Fabled Passage finds being able to untap if we control 4 or more lands. Witch's Cottage is a really high upside in this deck card that allows us to put a creature from our graveyard on top of our library if we control 3 other basic swamps. And Castle Locthwain enters the battlefield untapped if we control a swamp, taps to add a black.
And that's this week's video. If you like this video, be sure to like and subscribe, share it with a friend to help the channel grow, hit that bell icon to get notifications about new videos so you don't miss anything. I also want to give a shout out to my buddy Rob Slota for making the Who Wants to Brawl logo. He's a tattoo artist, and you can check out his work on Instagram using the link below. You can also email me at whowantstobrawl@gmail.com for any deck tech ideas. You can follow me on Twitter at whowantstobrawl. Also, check me out on Twitch. I stream last week's deck tech at 11 on Sundays. I also stream random Magic things on Mondays at 8 o'clock. And I try to get another stream in randomly throughout the week, sometimes Magic, sometimes not. Be sure to check out Twitter for when I pop up. But for now, this is Who, and I'm letting you know I'm done brawling for now. We'll see you later.